The rare clouds were propelled by a languorous but forceful wind, which stirred the bushes flanking the embankment and caused the reeds surrounding the small lake to rustle with an intense fervency. As the man walked along the railroad tracks, the tumultuous wind served as both a lifeline and a hindrance. While the gusts provided a refreshing gust of air to his face, they also forced him to remain vigilant and caused him to nervously shiver at the slightest rustle. As the July day drew to a close, the blinding disk of sunshine gradually descended toward the horizon. The encroaching darkness provided a sense of hopefulness, and the man allowed himself to unwind. He decelerated his pace and eventually came to a complete stop. While scanning the surroundings for any signs of life, he reluctantly released his grip from the handlebars of his bike. Riding along the gravel-covered railroad embankment was far too hazardous, as even a small stone could puncture his tire at any moment. However, the railroad leading out of town seemed like a relatively safe route, so the man had no other option but to carefully guide his bicycle alongside him for several hours. With caution, the man lowered the bicycle onto the grass and stood upright. He adjusted his heavily worn cap, wiped away the beads of sweat that had formed on his forehead, and scanned his surroundings once more. The landscape had remained relatively unaltered for the past few hours. The same corroded railroad tracks and the same long, sturdy structures of deserted industrial complexes in the distance. The only noticeable variation was the lake encircled by tall reeds, but swimming in it would have been out of the question. Who knew if the contamination had penetrated the stagnant water? Besides, he was an inept swimmer. He scrunched his nose, removed the fingerless leather glove from his right hand, and scrutinized it closely. The leather on his palm was in poor condition, and it would be advantageous for him to find a way to treat it, or at least enhance his ability to hold onto the handlebars for an extended period. The journey ahead was lengthy, and my energy was rapidly depleting. With sunset approaching, it was imperative to locate a suitable spot for a brief respite. The low brick edifice visible ahead, situated at a distance from the embankment, appeared to be a viable option. Making use of the brake, the man tended to his knees without abandoning his bicycle on the ground. After adjusting the straps of his backpack and pulling up his glove, he proceeded in the direction of the potential refuge. With his bicycle lifted above the ground, the man traversed the final 150 meters and endeavored to walk as noiselessly as possible. The diminutive edifice was evidently unfinished, but this was not unexpected, as comparable structures were commonplace throughout the Forsaken region. Following the rapid spread of the contagion across Eastern Europe, most of the survivors migrated westward in search of safety, abandoning their residences and possessions. Regardless of the derelict appearance of the unfinished building, it would be inaccurate to assert that it was completely unoccupied. With scarcely audible footsteps, he drew near to the dark entrance and peered tentatively into the space, prepared to leap onto his bicycle and flee at a moment's notice. The edifice was unoccupied, but the walls were adorned with graffiti and crude obscenities, and the ground was littered with rags, plastic bags, discarded syringes, and shattered glass. In the corner, the stench of excrement lingered as dung flies swarmed over a colossal pile of feces, haphazardly concealed by a pair of soiled papers. The man's apprehension began to dissipate, and he entered the building with less caution. Without reservation, he wheeled his bicycle inside and propped it against the wall before removing his backpack and inspecting its contents. The water in his bottle would suffice for another day, perhaps two if he rationed it. His rations consisted of a can of preserved beef, canned corn, and a pair of hard-as-nails Franzoluta oatmeal biscuits. Restocking seemed to be a distant possibility, so the man contented himself with nibbling on half a cookie and taking a brief swig from his half-liter plastic bottle. The man positioned his bicycle on the footboard and kept it within his sight as he cleared a spot on the floor to rest for a while. He hoped to fall into an uneasy half-sleep for an hour and a half with his trusty bicycle by his side. It took a moment for the man to register the appearance of a long, thin figure in the doorway, blocking the fading sunlight. He was fortunate that the stranger he saw was more interested in rummaging through the trash than in confronting him. The man had company, and it wasn't entirely unwelcome. The stranger was busy sorting through the debris and had even brought along a decent, if used, bicycle. At the bottom of the backpack, The man had a kitchen cleaver and a Bakel pneumatic pistol. However, he was not much of a fighter and lacked foresight. After a few tense seconds, the stranger evaluated the situation, and with a quick motion, drew an army knife from his belt and approached the man who was still crouched on the floor. The man's quick reflexes saved him from harm. Without thinking, he stood up, grabbed his bicycle with both hands, and used it as a shield against the intruder's attack. The surprised intruder lost his balance, fell to the ground, and dropped his knife. Seizing the opportunity, the man lifted his bicycle over his head and struck the intruder with it. The intruder shielded himself with one hand while reaching for his knife with the other, but the man struck him again with the bicycle. The intruder begged for mercy, but the man continued to strike him with the bicycle until he stopped moving. The man's pleas fell on deaf ears as the bicycle continued its brutal assault, rising and falling with increasing force. "No, no, no!" the man shouted, but the bicycle continued its assault, rising and falling with increasing ferocity. The sickening sound of bones being crushed and ground into dust filled the air until finally the sound stopped. Ignoring the cries, the man remained focused and lifted his bicycle with the same unwavering determination. The man's eyes were veiled in red, leaving it unclear whether he was experiencing an adrenaline rush or if the blood of a defeated opponent was simply spilling onto his face. Nonetheless, he vehemently exclaimed, "No, no, no!" As the man let out a series of heart-wrenching screams, he suddenly realized that the sound was coming from his own throat. Overcome with shock and horror, he dropped his bicycle and clutched his trembling hands to his head. The lifeless body of the man on the ground lay before him, a gruesome sight of shattered bones and brain matter. Oddly, there was little blood on the floor, but upon looking up, the man saw that the walls and ceiling were coated in a rich burgundy liquid, as if an artist had carelessly splashed it about with a broad brush. The bicycle, once black, was now mostly red, with bits of flesh adorning the spokes and chain. The man let out a final moan before quickly snatching his blood-stained backpack from the ground and making a swift exit with his bicycle. Upon exiting, the man briefly pondered if he was still asleep and if the events that had just unfolded were simply another haunting nightmare that would soon jolt him awake. The scenery around him consisted of a railroad, reeds, a lake with purple-tinted water, and abandoned factories in the distance. It seemed as though the defeated enemy's blood had flooded the entire neighborhood, painting everything in shades of purple. In order to regain his composure, the man had to take a moment to gaze at the setting sun. Soon after, he caught sight of two more enemies who were wielding army knives and charging towards him from the direction of their fallen comrade, oblivious to the fate that had befallen him. The man briefly glanced in their direction before preparing for their attack. Just as the man was about to position his bicycle in front of him once again, he abruptly halted and redirected his attention towards some noises originating from the railway embankment. Despite the gruesome sight of brain matter stuck in his bicycle pedals, the man did not succumb to terror. Though he shuddered, he promptly pushed aside any thoughts of the approaching armed enemies, mounted his bicycle, and pedaled with all his might. As the men wielding knives were running, the pungent odor reached their nostrils, causing them to come to an abrupt halt. The beings by the railway tracks were eerily silent. No howls or growls escaped their lips. Instead, all that could be heard was the rasp of their labored breaths and the shuffle of gravel underfoot. These repulsive creatures, with their tattered clothes, slimy bodies, twisted backs, limbs, and rotting features, were once human. The sight of them sent shivers down the spine, causing panic and revulsion. A group of about a dozen of these undead beings ran along the embankment, defying all logic with their speed despite their broken bones and atrophied limbs. With a few swift leaps, the creatures closed in on the hesitant men. The exhausted man, who had been pedaling with all his might, heard heart-wrenching screams that echoed through his being. Although he didn't dare turn around, he had a good idea of what was happening to the slow marauders. He had witnessed the gruesome scene before. Limbs ripped from bodies, entrails torn apart and spilling out, chunks of flesh bitten off, genitals crushed, exposed muscles quivering, and still beating hearts ripped from their chests. This was what had happened to his friends and others who had fallen behind the group. The flesh that had become entangled with the bike chain prevented him from pedaling any further. He was acutely aware that some of the monsters were hot on his heels, chasing him relentlessly. He knew that if he came to a halt again, it could very well be his final moment. Up ahead, he spotted the cars of a Soviet passenger train that had derailed ages ago. A massive heap of rusted scrap metal obstructed the road, leaving only a narrow passage along the embankment. Riding a bicycle was out of the question in this terrain, and abandoning his trusty two-wheeler to flee on foot would surely result in a slow and excruciating death. As the wagons approached, the man frantically searched for any gap in the debris where he could ride his bike. In his haste, he failed to notice that the sun had set a few minutes prior. Gradually, the sound of gravel under the pursuing creature's feet grew fainter, and he realized that he was pulling ahead. Only when he finally had to veer to the side of the train tracks did he dare to glance back. To his surprise, all of the creatures had collapsed on the ground, some weakly scrabbling at the gravel with curled fingers, while others remained completely motionless in a crouched position. The man held his breath, scarcely able to believe his luck. He dismounted his bike and limped over to the first creature lying frozen on the gravel, his legs stiff from the ordeal. He couldn't recall when he had slung his blood-stained knapsack over his shoulder, but now, fumbling through its contents, he finally found what he was looking for. He knelt before the immobilized creature, hefting the kitchen cleaver in his hand, poised to strike.